speaker, they will be able to give his presentation the way he has planned it. And we say this in the next time, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Hello, I'm Jenny Paulson from the Rollins Center for Entrepreneurship and Technology at Brigham Young University. Welcome to the Entrepreneur Lecture Series. Today we'll be hearing from Steve Owen of the Great Harvest Bread Company. Steve began his career working as a lease broker, but had a desire to start his own business. When he and his wife Jane saw the opportunity in 1989, Steve went through the application process and was awarded the Great Harvest Bread Company franchise for Provo and the southern part of Utah. Over the next 5 years, he opened 3 additional stores in Utah, including St. George, Orem, and American Fork. He also opened 3 stores in Nevada, including Las Vegas, Reno, and Sparks. Between 1998 and 2003, he began selling his stores to the managers of each location. It has also been very rewarding for him to see so many of his employees become franchise owners and build their own businesses. He retained the Provo store and still owns and operates this store today with his son Jason. The Marriott School of Management welcomes Steve Owen to the Entrepreneur Lecture Series.
Thank you, Jenny. As I look into your faces and I think of where I was at your age, I remember sitting in a class at Rick's College prior to going to the University of Utah. And it was a class like this, invited to come, somewhat of a seminar. And I still remember one thing that I learned in that class that has really helped me. So I hope there's maybe just one thing that you'll remember here today. The one thing that I learned, I'll tell you what it was. And that was, it was a man who owned a printing company. And he started the printing company from the ground floor. And he said to us that you need to learn to do everything, every aspect of that little business by yourself, and then learn to delegate. And I don't know why, but that just stuck with me, and it helped me in years to come. And I'll refer to that in just a few minutes. But I look into your faces and I think, well, I hope that you'll just take maybe 1 or 2 things away today that will help you in your quest for whatever your vocation will be in the future. As was said, we own Great Harvest Bread Company in Provo now. It's been quite a journey, and I guess if I could say there's any topic that I would be addressing here today, it would be the importance of the entrance and exit strategy. Now, I don't have a great entrance and exit strategy, but it somehow evolved. But it began in the very beginning. And so what I'm going to do is tell you somewhat of a story of how we became franchise owners of Great Harvest Bread Company and how we got in and also kind of how we got out of some of the stores. And I think it's important to know that. You just don't go through life and keep building and building and building. There's some time where you're going to have to get out, and you need to kind of think that through. So it kind of begins this way. When I was younger, I was somewhat of an entrepreneur, and I had a little landscaping business. I built custom logs furniture going through college, and then I went to school at the University of Utah and graduated in finance. The hope was that I could go out and work for someone and get some experience and then have my own business. I even thought that probably what I would do is graduate, go and work for a year, come back and get an MBA, and go out and start my own business after working for someone. After I graduated from the University of Utah, I went to work for a company, and 7 months later was offered a chance to be a vice president of a little startup company. So I never went back and got my MBA. I got into business and took off. And I worked there for about 6 years. And during that time, my wife had been buying some bread from a little store up in Holiday called Great Harvest Bread Company. I had no idea anything about this, about the bread or anything, but one day I was just commenting how good this bread was, and I was anxious to maybe do something on my own. I was a little bit frustrated at that time. I'd been working for 6 years for this company, wanting to expand, maybe go off and do something on my own. I thought about being a coach, a teacher. I'd done that in college and coached a few teams. And she turned to me and she said, what about that little bread store in Holiday? Have you ever been in there? Maybe you ought to go in there and do that. And I looked at her and said, you're kidding me. A baker? I had never baked a thing in my entire life. I didn't know anything about it. But she had wanted to open a little bakery at some time in her life. That's kind of the way it's been. She gives me the idea and then makes me run with it. But that's kind of what happened. Honestly, one day in December of 1987, I was driving, I had my suit on coming back from work, and I looked over at the intersection and there was that little bakery. So I decided to pull in. I pulled in and I still remember what I saw. I walked in this, it's not exactly where their store is now, they were in just a little teeny shop. And I walked in the door and the aroma hit me. And I saw these employees back there just pounding out this bread and eating this bread. And there was music going, and the atmosphere just caught me. I noticed this funny looking little machine by the door. I didn't know what it was. It looked like an antique piece of furniture. I learned later it was what they call a bun divider. It was their roll press, but it was old and it was just sitting there. These were little things that I observed, and someone said, hey, do you want a slice of bread? And I went up and got a slice of bread and began to eat it. And then my wheels got turning in my head, and I asked a couple of questions, and I said, I think my wife had told me it was a franchise, so I asked her, are you a franchise? And she peeled off a little piece of paper and said, yes, you can call this number and talk to them. Well, I have to tell you that this happens very few times in your life, but it happened to me that day. I immediately said in my mind, I'm going to do this. I had no idea how to do it or what to do, but I said I'm going to do it. I drove home and I told my wife, I said, Jane, I'm going to do one of these. And so I called the number and I began to tell them that I was anxious to start a bread store and da-da-da-da-da, and they immediately turned back to me on the phone and said, well, we have 100 people in the waiting line in front of you. So fill out some information, we'll send you, and send it back. And I thought, oh, you've got to be kidding me. I thought I could just say I want one and they'd award me a franchise. Well, a couple of days later, in the mail, I got a packet, and in it was a bunch of information on Great Harvest franchising and opening a bread company. As I began to read through it, it was interesting because it began to talk about all the reasons you would not want to open a bakery. This is hard. You got to get up in the morning and grind wheat. You have to get up at 4:30 in the morning, put an apron on. You're going to get flour in your nose. I mean, it was all of these funny little things, and I thought, why are they doing this? And as I just kind of waded through this, I started thinking, I like this. This is weeding out a lot of people. And got to the end and read everything, and I filled out a bunch of information and took a Polaroid picture of my wife and I FedExed it to them the next day. And they called me the next day and said, wow, you're serious. And I said, I told you, I really want to do one of these. Well, that was kind of the beginning, and I was anxious, but I had to sell myself to them. I had to get approved. They did a lot of background check on me, and finally they invited us up to Dillon, Montana, little town of Dillon, Montana. And we met with them, and I'll never forget, we met with Pete and Laura Wakeman, who are the owners of the franchise company, and we sat at a little booth in a restaurant, and they pulled out a little piece of paper and took a few notes and said, you know, we like you guys, and we'd like you to open a store. I mean, it was just about like that. And so that was how it all began. And then we had to figure out where we were going to open a store. So there were all these phases. I had to sell myself to them, have the desire, but I didn't know what to do. I went to my employer and I told him that this is what I was going to do, and he thought I was crazy and tried to persuade me not to open a store. But I was committed, and I told him I'd give him 6 months. And I would, in the company I was working with, there were some projects I was working on. I said, I'll give you 6 months and I'll close all these projects up and sell off these portfolios and different things. And in September, I need to leave. I'd like to work for you about a half a day if that's possible, and you can cut my salary in half, and in 6 months I need to go. And he agreed, so that's kind of what happened. But I had to find a location. And we looked up north in northern Utah, we looked down south, and for some reason I just felt more comfortable with the Provo area. So we looked for locations and finally determined that this little place called Brigham's Landing Shopping Center was a good spot for us. And I, during that time, was buying equipment along the way. I'd go to auctions when I had time off and buy a mill or a mixer, bread pans, whatever I could buy along the way. I'd take them home and put them in our garage, and then I'd spend Saturdays out there power spraying them off, trying to clean them. And so it was just an amazing process. And I left that employment in September. We sold our home. We had a baby the same month, so now we had 4 little kids. Left my employment, and I thought, what am I doing? Is this a good move or not? I had a good salary and a good job. I was safe and secure. I had medical insurance, all these different things, and I kind of tossed it aside and said, I really think this might work. And the hope was that I would possibly make the same income that I made in my other job. If I could just do that and own my own little business and have a good little family, that would be just great. And that's about as far as I really thought ahead. On January 11th of 1989, we opened our doors. I hired a couple of employees, and that's something that I had not really thought about up until about 2 weeks before we opened our doors, and I realized I can't do this alone. I guess I need to hire some employees. So we hired 2 or 3. One was my brother-in-law, and I went in and I began to bake the bread, to knead the bread, to slice the bread, to do everything during the day with a couple of people. Now I'll go back to that lesson I learned in that class one day at Rick's College, and I remembered, learn every aspect of the business yourself and then delegate. So the first day I did everything, and that night I was so tired, and I had to count the cash. I had to make the deposit to the bank. And I made the deposit to the bank, and I said, I'll never have to do this again. And the very next day, I trained another employee how to do that. Never did the deposits. You'd think you'd want to be doing the deposits every day, but I didn't need to do that. So I delegated one task. And then I trained someone into making the cookies. Actually, my wife came in and would do the cookies for a few days. So I began to take all of this and delegate it out, but I knew how to do it so that I could train new people. And I guess if I were to frame this in a category, I would call this the concept and planning stage or the phase. It was trying to figure out how to get open and planning to get open. But honestly, that's as far as I had thought through this thing. I hadn't really gone much further than that. The first day that we opened, I still remember we were all excited. We had to plan for so many loaves of bread. 9:30 in the morning came, we hadn't had one customer. I was nervous. I was thinking, we've got hundreds of loaves of bread here. What's going to happen? By 11:45, we were sold out. And I had to tell customers for the next 5 hours, we don't have any bread, please come back tomorrow. That's this kind of industry. You have to plan really well. And we've done that every single day for 20 years now. It's planning at night, taking an inventory and then planning for the next day. As we began to grow, it was by word of mouth. In this little valley, people talk. And word got out. We didn't have to do a lot of advertising. And we just began to sell a lot of product. And the business did well. And interesting enough that all of the franchises throughout the country at that time, everybody just owned one. And after a couple of years, I had these great employees that were working with me they were just wonderful. One of them was a baker, and one of them was an afternoon person. They were kind of my managers. One day my baker came to me and he says, well, I'm getting ready to graduate, and so I'll be leaving. I'd never thought that he would leave. I had never considered that I would have an employee leave. I don't know why, but it just didn't cross my mind. So it was another learning curve for me. And I thought about that. I'd had a few employees leave during that time, but it was just temporary responsibilities they had. But this was my main baker. And I thought about that for several days, and I all of a sudden thought, wow, you're either going to use them or lose him? How can I use this good man to keep working for me? And then I thought about maybe doing a second location, but it had never been done. So I called the franchise headquarters and asked them, would it be possible to open a second store? And they thought about it and called me a few days later and said, why don't you give us a proposal and let's discuss it. And so we did. And then I went to this employee and I asked him, I said, would you be interested in working with me in the store and I would make you a part owner? And he jumped at the chance. He was excited. He was only 23 years old. He thought, be a business owner? And this is what I'd love to do. So that was kind of the start of another process in that. And we went down to St. George and looked for a location and found a little spot. And a few months later, we signed a lease and we were going to have another location. Now, how do you do that? Here I have this great employee, and now I'm thinking, do I have him be a manager? Do I make him a partner? And I didn't know how to do any of this either. There was no model for it. So we sat down at a table at a little restaurant and pulled out a piece of paper, and this is how I discussed it, and this has kind of formed a model for future bakeries. I said, I'll tell you what, you're going to be the one down here running this. I'm still going to be in Provo. I will make you a 49% owner. I will be 51, so I'll be the majority owner. And you need to put in 49% of the money, and I'll put in 51% of the money. But I will sell this store to you after 5 years, so it can become yours, and you can buy my 51%. What do you think about that? And we discussed that, and he thought that was a great idea. Well, to make a long story short, we made a decision that he would be 49%, and he came with that money, and I came with 51, and then I paid him a salary, and each year I would let him vest 10%. So at the end of 5 years, and the last year was 9%, so at the end of 5 years, he had built up to his 49% ownership. And then in that 5th year, I gave him a 1-year window, an option to purchase my 51. He could do it or not. If he didn't do it within that year, then we just remained partners. And but he did. And that became the model. And so from 1994 through 1998 or somewhere around there, we built a store a year with one of our employees with that same model and had them come in and become a partner. Now, the reason I think that worked well for us is because if you have a manager can give you a 2 weeks notice and be gone. In our business, if he would have given me 2 weeks notice in St. George and left, what would I have done? The baking industry is, like we do it in Great Harvest, is kind of an art, and it takes a long time to learn how to bake really good bread. Now, if he's a partner and he's vested 20 or 30% and he gives me 2 weeks notice and walks away, what's he walking away from? A tremendous vested interest. And that might even be to my advantage. And so it protected me, but it gave them a great opportunity to have ownership. So it worked really, really well. And we ended up building 7 stores that way. We began to grow a little bit more as we added other product lines. We didn't just sell cookies and bread. We ended up over the years doing sandwiches and drinks and different things, add-ons. Right now we actually do dry mixes. We do hot chocolate. We do the sandwiches. We do several things. So we've kind of broadened out a little bit as well. And that's another way we've grown. And we've done a little bit of wholesaling. So not just selling within our own store and things going out the front door, but we've sold bread out the back door on delivery racks that go to a few stores. Now, we did not do that aggressively because I wanted to protect what we did. We didn't want to become a wholesale company. So we only sell to a few stores, but it still helps our business to grow. Here's another learning curve that I had. After we opened all these stores, we had a little bit of a problem, and it's called honesty and integrity. And everything was going really well, and then one day I noticed, and financial statements come down the road. You don't usually find out the very day someone's dishonest. You usually find out a month or 2 or 3 months later. You kind of get an indication based on financial statements. And so our deposits were all pretty good, but I noticed that our net profit was not as good as it had been. And it caused me some concern. I called this one store and began to talk to my one partner, and he said everything was okay. But everything was not okay, and there were some decisions that had been made that some dishonesty, and I ended up having to go out there and find out about it, and it was kind of ugly. And I ended up having to fire my partner, and that became a very difficult time for me. It was a time where we were very busy in our family and calling I had in our church and different things, and it kind of took the steam out of me and my desire to want to grow anymore. I got a little sour, and so we stopped growing, and I said, I've got to put out this fire, and I want to make sure that everything's okay. And so that was in about 1998. We stopped growing, and I began to look at financial statements really closely and try to protect things, and that's kind of when we stopped. The good news is that was just at the time when the 5-year options were kicking in for my partners, and they were beginning to buy them, the stores. There was also something else that happened. We were growing drastically, and then all of a sudden this protein diet came out. And all of a sudden everybody thought bread was poison. And I was thinking, well, let's see. Why don't you go read Section 89? No. But honestly, what happened is bread sales across the country just plummeted. And some of the great harvest bread companies closed up, as well as many other bakeries around the country. And it was because of that protein diet. They basically said, eat all this protein, eat a lot of fat and this and that, and don't eat any carbohydrates. Well, that was here for about 2 or 3 years, and then it went away. We don't have that anymore, but it was a really rough time in our industry. And I was grateful when that happened that we'd already made agreements, and I'd already sold several of my stores. In the year 2000, I was grateful that I didn't own 7 stores, and I was trying to run them because I think it would have been the kiss of death. Trying to have a partner and making money on that. The other thing is, when I started in this business, I had little kids, little mouths to feed, but they grow and they get more expensive, and you get about 40 years old and it costs more to live. And I knew that my partners at age 23 didn't need as much money as they would at 33 or 43. And so I was grateful that I was able to have sold to them, and they became the sole owners of the stores. We did a little business called MTC Cookies, and it was a girl that came to me one time, and she said she had this little business, but she couldn't do it alone. She was really tired trying to run it out of her home. We already had a bakery. We already had phone lines, visas, and everything, credit card ability, and had employees. And so she came in and asked me if I would want to buy her business. And I told her, I'm really not interested in buying your business, but why don't we joint venture this thing? And you keep doing what you're doing, but we'll just bring it into our store. You do the marketing, we'll do all the legwork. We'll do all the production. And that worked really well. What that was is it was selling little cookie packages and things up to the MTC and around the world. I don't know if any of you ever received one of those or anything like that. We did that for 4 years. And then in 2004, my wife and I received an assignment that took us out of this state for 3 years and had to make a decision on what to do. So we had to simplify. Wasn't it great that we owned 1 store at that time instead of 7? We actually owned 2. One was I still owned the Reno store, and I was selling that one at the time. But that would have been very difficult. And our son, who was 22, just returned from his mission, said he would step up to the plate and run the business while we were gone. And so, 22-year-old kid took the reins and ran that business for us for 3 years. We tried to simplify things. We took away the MTC line and a few other things and made it a little easier for him, but we were so glad when we came back in July and the store was still standing and it was doing just fine. That's kind of our story. There's a few things I may have left out. We had some competition along the way where people saw in 1989 when we opened how well we were doing and grew, and little bread stores opened up along the way, and quite honestly I never went to any of them. I just felt like I'm going to play in my own sandbox. We'll make the best bread and do what we need to do, but I don't want to be too distracted going out and trying to compete. We're not competing with them, they're competing with us. That was the way I looked at it. And that helped us. We'd kind of led the way. I think right now what I'd like to ask you, now that you've heard what we have done, do you have any questions, anything that you'd like to know that might lead me in a direction of how I might teach a little bit more? Anything on your mind?
In the early stages of starting your first company, how did you find the funds? Did you already have enough saved up for the machines? And stuff?
Yes, great question. Great question. Along the way, my wife and I had tried to save money. We'd received counsel that we should put savings away. And during the first 6 years of our marriage, we were able to pay our mortgage down. And when we sold our home, we had our home paid for. And so when we came to Provo, we rented a little condominium in Shadowbrook Condominiums, and we had all this cash. So we didn't have to leverage at all. And that was a really great thing, to have the money to start the business and some other funds along the way, and then the business took off. And that's the way we did all the stores from then. We didn't borrow any money, we just funded it out of our own pockets. Yes?
What do you think was helpful in finding good employees? And you said that you learned how to do everything. Did you train each of the employees, or did you also delegate the training at some time? And
thank you. Let me tell you just a little phrase that I came up with, and it's this: I would rather hire a happy camper and teach them how to work than hire someone that thinks they know how to work and teach them how to be a happy camper. It was all about attitude. In our business, I didn't need anybody who really had a lot of skill. But when someone would walk in the door, I would look at their face, notice their countenance and their desire. I would make calls and to see, the references. But I could get a real good feel just on being around someone if they're going to be good with customers. You got quality, cleanliness, and service. And I had to look at each employee and say, can that person do that? Now the bakers that come in early in the morning at 3:30 in the morning and work until say 9 or 10, they're not dealing with customers as much. So I wasn't quite as concerned with their personability as I was with those that came in at 9 and worked until 6. The training that I would do, and I did a lot of the training because I knew what every task was. But then I would try to train someone else to be able to train, so I didn't have to always do it. So, and what we did was this, and we still do it this day, it's kind of a model that we use, is when someone comes in our store, we have them work alongside someone, and they are not to really do much. They're not in charge of anything. They just watch this employee and listen. And that employee is responsible for doing every task that day and explaining why and what they're doing. And the next day, we tell the employee at the end of that day, tomorrow when you come in, you're doing it. And we will observe you doing that. And then we would do that for several days. So it was kind of a inspect what you expect type thing. And some tasks like bread, we have to do that for 2 to 3 weeks. For someone slicing bread, we could do that for 1 day. So the training really differed on the different tasks that we would do. Okay? Yes?
Did you already know how to bake, or did you get the skills?
How did I get the skills?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I had none. I had no idea how to bake. At that time when we bought the franchise, we were required to go to 3 different bakeries around the country and train there for a day, and then 1 store for 3 days. So we ended up going to Great Falls, Montana, Boise, Idaho, Portland, Oregon, and then we ended up in the Holiday store for 3 days in Salt Lake. And so we learned a little bit there, and that was months before we opened. And then when you open, they send 2 trainers, and they came from the Washington, Seattle store, and they stayed with us for 2 weeks. And just were right there alongside of us and trained us how to do things, and then they said goodbye and left. And then we were on our own. And then we had to learn and develop things along the way. So that's how that worked. Yes?
I'd just like to hear your thoughts about a franchise model versus if you had tried to set up your own type of company, and any kind of words of advice about opening your own franchise.
Okay. Well, the success rate for a franchise is probably 90% versus a startup on your own is probably 10%. Those figures may have changed a little bit, but the reason is because you have such a support. Now you have to pay a royalty for that. We pay a 5% royalty, 5% of our gross sales every single month. So if you do, $100,000 in sales in a month, you're writing a check for $5,000 back to the franchise. And then for that, they give you support. So I can call them at any time and ask for any advice. They help us purchase. We have a co-oping, so we can have more purchasing power. They help us with advertising, different things like that. So there's a tremendous benefit with being with a franchise company. I would think that you could do something on your own if you knew it well enough. I would think now that I've been doing this for so long, I could probably go and start my own bakery. But I wouldn't have the brand name. That would be a big problem. And the other problem I'd have is I've signed a non-compete and a non-competition agreement, and I'd get in trouble. So I couldn't do that. So I am grateful. In fact, the larger check I can send to Great Harvest, the better it is, because that means I have more sales. So I firmly believe in that. Somebody had to be the beginner, though. Somebody had to start it. At one point in time, Pete and Laura Wakeman set up a card table back east and began to sell some bread that they made by a recipe that Pete found in a book one day. And that's how it started, on a card table back in Connecticut. And then they started a franchise company. Yes?
I was just curious, when you expanded and created partnerships, how did you convince them to go all the way up to 49% when they were putting 100% sweat equity? Or would you go down there for quite a time?
Okay, good question. They would put in 49%, let's say it's $100,000. They'd put in $49,000, I put in $51,000, but I paid them a salary. So I paid them a salary to run the store, and then we would split profits. So I'll give you just an example. Say I paid them a $2,000, $2,500 a month salary. There's your base salary to run the store, and then at the end of the month, what if we have $10,000 in profits? You get $4,900 and I get $5,100. So that's how that worked.
So
Okay.
job security as well.
Yes. Now, a couple of the stores, I had these partners that they couldn't come up with $49,000, for example. So now what do? Well, what I did is I paid for it all, and then I took a note for $49,000, and they paid me off over time, the 5 years. So we amortized a 5-year note, $49,000 at an interest rate, and so they would have to pay that back. So even though they were getting a salary during that month, they still had to send a check back to me for that $49,000 plus interest. Does that make sense? Okay. So we had to adapt a little bit with a few of them. It worked out good. Yes?
It seems that you empowered your key employees by allowing them to become partners. How did other employees react to that?
That's a great question. Some of them didn't bother at all because they were there to go to BYU and move on. And others, it really bothered them. When's my shot at getting a bakery? And most of those got their opportunity. I remember having our first employee that I did that store with down in St. George. And I think at the time, everybody was kind of in the watch and see mode. And when they saw that store take off, they started coming to me saying, hey, I'm interested. And another one we sent to Reno, another one we sent to Las Vegas, and we just kind of moved it around. But it all worked out. I don't know that we had any that were upset, because the ones that wanted to, I tried to work work it out for them. Yes.
How have the other 7 done since you sold them?
Well, I think today we have 12 stores now off of the 7. Let's see, the Provo store is doing well, the Orem store does well, the American Fork store, actually I sold it with the Orem store some time ago, and they actually closed the American Fork store because they didn't want to have to deal with 2. So that was their decision, and they closed it. The St. George store, he opened another location down there, and then he opened Cedar City as well. And he's opened Cedar City with his brother-in-law in a partnership like I did with him. Interesting. Let's see, the Las Vegas store has opened a few. They've opened, I think, they have 3 or 4 down there now. And interesting enough, and I don't know if this is for sure, I would think that they're getting in an age where they may want to sell their stores, and you know, that exit strategy. They sold one to another manager of mine, and so they're all doing well. The Reno store, I sold that one. The Spark store, they closed that one. So, you know, I guess don't be afraid to open and close things. It's not a pride thing. I can't close this, I'm going to let it die because I don't want anybody to know that I closed a store. You've got to be wise with that. And we had to make decisions looking at these different stores and saying, this one's doing well, this one is not doing as well. Is it going to work to put more money into this store and build it up, or would it be better to close this location and build this one up? And let me just tell you one other thing that happened in our Reno area. We had 2 stores out there and we wanted to close the Spark store, but the problem was we had a lease for 5 years. That's a lot of money at $3,000 or $4,000 a month added up. How do you get out of a lease? So sometimes in a business, you got to be really careful when you sign a lease for 5 years. You better know that you're going to have to keep that store going for 5 years, or you're going to have to sublease the property to someone, or you're going to close up and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, or go bankrupt or something. So there's a big risk involved with that, and I was always very careful when we did that. Now the other thing you could do is buy your own building, and some of the great harvests have done that. And I kind of wished I would have done that for 1 or 2 of them along the way. If I could have found the right location, I would have probably bought the property. But we actually found a better location that we could lease, and so we had to make that decision. The business would do better here than it would have here. Okay? Yes?
Could you describe a typical day for you, like especially during maybe the hardest times, the most difficult times for you?
Okay, and it's right now, December. My day in the bakery right now is not what it was 20 years ago. I never intended it to be that way. I've delegated everything out now, but I control right now the finances. I control the payables and the receivables and make sure that that's all working. My son is in charge of all of the production. A hard day, in the month of December, we're extremely busy because we have the Christmas holidays, and a lot of people are getting gift baskets and ordering lots of different varieties of bread, and so business goes up. So we're pushed with our labor. We have to produce more. We have to hire a few more temporary people to come in. But I'll give you an example of a day in the life of a baker, a day in the life of a Great Harvest bread owner. It would be waking up and going into the store at about 4 or 4:30 in the morning, opening the store and turning the mill on. We grind our wheat every day. So turning the mill on and making sure that flour's coming through the hopper and into the brute and filling those up. There's a plan. Whenever we walk in, the plan has been sent the night before exactly what you will produce and the exact varieties and the amounts and everything. Now, without disclosing too much, I can tell you one of the great secrets of Great Harvest bread is the recipe has to be just right, and you have to add exact right ingredients, and the temperature of the air and the water and everything around us is important. And how long do we proof the bread? How long does it sit? How long does it bake? All of these things. So that baker, when he goes in the morning, kind of has to see the end from the beginning. And if he makes that dough just right, then it can make a great bread. So then it sits for a couple of hours, and we throw this big bowl with about 150 to 200 pounds of dough up on the table. That's why all our bakers have such strong biceps. They take a bowl and throw this up on the table, and this huge amount of dough is on the table, and we divide it into loaves, put them in the pans, and let that rest for a little bit. That's the rising of the dough. Proofing is what we call it. And just when it's just right, then we send it in the oven. It bakes for 40 to 50 minutes or so. Comes out, sits on the rack until it's cool, and then we slice it, bag it, put it out on the rack for sale, and we sell it. And at the end of the day, we take a complete closing inventory of every single item in the store. So we count everything that we made, and then we count what's left at the end of the day, and then we plan again, and we go do that again. And if you're, let me give you an example. I remember in 1995, it's just a year that I remember when business just jumped because we started doing gift baskets at the time. Now think about what load this put on us. We had been producing about 900 loaves of bread a day. And in December, we began baking 2,500 loaves a day. We tripled, almost tripled our load. We started having to come in and baking around the clock. And I was the one that was responsible for all the planning and everything, and I didn't get much sleep. I remember there were days where I got about 2 or 3 hours of sleep. It was tough, but I could see the end, December 24th, so it kind of works. So during the year we have a few peaks, but December usually always really goes high, and then it kind of levels out again. Does that kind of help? Any other questions that you can think of?
Just
Yes.
one last question. With the franchise, how hard was it with your inventory? I noticed you said in your lecture sometimes you had inventory problems where you were out of bread to bake. Did the franchise always help you as far as your suppliers go, or did you have to find a lot of those yourself?
Both. We try to use a lot of local suppliers. So someone who's back on the East Coast that's a franchisee would use a local person back there. But for us, we use a local honey supplier, and so the franchise isn't going to really help us much with that. The wheat is where they give us our best support. All of the wheat for all of the great harvest bread companies throughout the United States all get it from the same source, and it's tested, and that is the main ingredient. So that's what we're concerned about. We basically send a royalty check in saying, you get us good wheat. We can take care of the rest, but we need good wheat. There's some troubleshooting things that come up. All of a sudden you'll have a loaf of bread that it doesn't proof, and it just doesn't look right. Is it salt? Is it yeast? Is it wheat? Is it honey? We don't have very many ingredients. What is it? I had it was a terrible experience we had about 8 years ago. I was coaching a Little League game on a Saturday morning, and my baker called and said, Steve, I don't know what's happened, but we don't have any salt in any of the bread. 900 loaves of bread had to be thrown in the garbage, and no one got bread that Saturday. I was just sick. I went in, we could not figure out what had happened. I said, did you put the salt in? I went through all of the process and everything. That was a Saturday. Monday, he called and said, there's no salt in the bread today. I wanted to wring his neck. What are you talking about? Did you put the bread? And what had happened is when they delivered the salt and the sugar, they had put the sugar in the salt spot, and they had dumped a bag of sugar in the salt bucket. So he was putting sugar in thinking it was salt. And we found that out, fortunately, after the second day. But that could have gone on for a long time. Little things like that happen. But we get tremendous support from the franchise company. They really help us a lot. We have a website that we can go on, and any questions we have, there's a newsroom where we can go on and we can blog back and forth with people. So it's really been great for us. I know we only have just a minute left, but if I could just tell you, I hope that what I've said has helped you understand the one thing I said at the beginning, and that is you ought to have an entrance and an exit strategy if you're going to go into business. And you're not going to know everything that you need to do, but I can tell you that a franchise, like this young woman on the front said here, I would say it's the way to go. Unless you know how to do everything and you're just gung-ho, now it's going to be tough. But Great Harvest has blessed our lives. We've been very fortunate, and there's always challenges. And the challenge we have right now is the cost of wheat has doubled. The price of honey has doubled. And we can't double the price of our bread, so we have to figure that out. We're in the process of doing that right now. But it's an ongoing thing. I appreciate your time today and hope that you learned something. Thank you.